Welcome to tonight's lecture, which is, I'm standing in for Manijay, by the way, in case you haven't noticed. So I'm feeling somewhat intimidated, but also really excited to stand in her fancy shoes. Welcome to tonight's lecture, which is the next installment in the New Models lecture series. We were trying to count which new model this is, and we've actually lost count, which is a lovely place to be. The series began last autumn and has invited architects and other interdisciplinary spatial practitioners to think about how their work can change the models around which society is organised. So, no small task. Each event proposes a new model to address how we can shift power structures, socio-economic forces, and structural inequalities present in society today to give us new tools to rethink the world around us. Over the past year, a series of new models have been presented to underline the need to redesign institutions, redress who has access to funding, reverse the lack of representation in public art, embrace physical and digital spaces of collective care and mutuality, find new forms of community-led practice and design creativity, invent new forms of recognition, and address the interconnected and intersectional crises threatening the future of our planet. With much more to come in the year ahead, thanks to Manijay and the AA's fantastic programming. So I'm Shumi Bose. I'm an AA alumni, currently teaching with Experimental One. And I'm delighted to introduce tonight's speakers. I'm actually really excited to hear from tonight's speakers who, through their teaching, research, and recent built work and practices, are shifting power structures away from traditional Western architectural canons and perhaps towards the global south. So I'm just going to race through some brief introductions. Nana Biamah-Ofosu studied at Kingston School of Art and has worked at a number of amazing London-based practices. Nana was also part of the second cohort of new architecture writers and has since written articles for the RIAS, Architecture Today, the Architect's Journal, Frame Magazine, Icon, and Kinfolk, among others. She's currently Reviews and Insight Editor at the Architecture Research Quarterly ARQ. Bushra Mohamed studied at Kingston School of Art and has previously worked at practices in London and in the Netherlands. Bushra has contributed to publications such as the RIBA Journal, Now You Know, Tribune Magazine, and AA Files, and she was named Reba J. Rising Star in 2020. So we're in very starry company. Studio NYALI then is an interdisciplinary architecture, design, and research practice founded by Nana and Bushra in 2019. The practice is focused on identity, shared histories, and spaces, with a strong belief that architecture must be understood as the embodiment and artifact of the human experience. They're interested in how these ideas are manifested through diasporic cultural identities within post-colonial contexts and in relation to the future of cosmopolitan settlement. So tonight they're going to discuss, among other things, their very exciting participation in the ongoing Venice Architecture Biennale and quite what they have devised, constructed, and seek to pursue in their own practice. Before I hand over to Nana and Bushra, just a few notes on the format. They'll give their lecture momentarily, and following that, I'm going to ask a few initial questions before opening up to the audience for a wider discussion. Please don't rely on me to ask all the questions. You're all here. It would be wonderful to take your questions. Please write them up in the chat as and when they occur to you. You can either write them in DMs or you can write them to everybody. Vocalize your questions in the chat and I will bring them to the speakers. If you want, I can ask it on your behalf, or else you can use the raise hand function when it comes to the Q&A, and I can unmute you and you can ask the speakers yourselves. Lastly, if you feel comfortable enough to do so, please turn on your cameras. Whenever and throughout the lecture, it's always nice for speakers to know that they're talking to people rather than a number of black squares. We really appreciate the courage that it takes. Don't worry, all of us are in a state of relaxation. So if that's okay with you, then let's kick off. I will hand over to Nana and Bushra now. Thank you so much.
Thank you for the introduction, Shumi. I'm just going to share my screen. Probably click play. So yeah, really thank you for having us. Really honored to be here, part of the lecture series. I'm Bushra Mohamed.
And I'm Nana Biamah-Ofosu, and together we're directors of Studio NYALI and Diploma 2 Unit Masters of the AA. Studio NYALI is a London-based architecture, design and research practice founded in 2019. As Shumi mentioned, we are interested in examining, challenging and shifting architectural critiques and narratives towards a more inclusive and holistic understanding of the built environment.
So we started Studio NYALI out of the need to address what we felt was missing in contemporary architectural discourse, particularly in education and research, as well as how it affects architectural practice or architectural practice in general. As first-generation African immigrants, myself from Kenyan heritage and Nana Ghanaian, partly raised and educated as architects in the UK, we'd not seen our experiential understanding of space reflected in our academic or professional experience.
We learned about the architecture of Greek and Roman empires and became well-versed in the language of antiquity, classicism, modernism, and contemporary architecture, but neglected the influences and contributions of the architectural culture of the Southern Hemisphere. Our research started from a place of frustration, but we hope, and as we will present in the next 40 minutes, will become a site for reflection and reconfiguration of knowledge towards a more inclusive study of architecture in the built environment, most importantly, questioning what it means for us living today.
So we're going to speak about our research and investigations into compound house typology, particularly so far, its importance in cataloguing and documenting ways of living that have historically been excluded from the architectural canon. We argue their relevance to diasporic cultures and identities. Ultimately, we aim to change housing standards that affect ways of living relevant to the spatial and cultural needs of a pluralist demographic.
The new model we'll present is one of translation, exploring how we find new architectural languages and tools for communication and dissemination. It investigates identity and narrative as found, and also how it could be reflected in architecture. We believe we need new models that work to fill the gaps in our architectural history, given agency to and centering the other.
Our research to date examines how architecture can be understood as the embodiment and artifact of the human experience. By this, we mean we're interested in how ideas are manifested in post-colonial context and in relation to the future of cosmopolitan settlements. In addition, how a new model of translation can contribute to a more sustainable urban development, one that is rooted in history, culture, socio-economic, and climatic reading of a place.
If we consider architecture to be the result of a people's imaginations and buildings as a physical manifestation of their aspirations, then we must reconsider the universal, international, and singular language of architecture that has for so long served as a principal vision for progress. This phenomenon has not happened in isolation. It is the result of industrialization, colonization, and globalization. On the African continent, the effects of colonization are still present in the urban fabric of the built environment.
So contemporary planning in Africa can be traced back to colonial roots as a tool introduced from the perspective of countries that had relatively high levels of urbanization, with clear vested interests in the extraction and control of the continent's natural resources. Many African cities are still overcoming this legacy of colonial spatial structure and planning regulations.
For instance, in many British colonies, policies discouraged the large-scale provision of public housing in order to contain rural and to urban migration, in which unemployed Africans were repatriated back to their places of origin. Moreover, access to the city was restricted by the colonial governments, which provided accommodation solely for individual workers, excluding their families. This structure, it could be argued, prioritized the Western reading of family rather than designing with the extended family structures in mind.
So planning practices instituted at this time jumpstart processes of socio-spatial segregation, which continue to be seen in present day. These practices were largely aimed at controlling the development of settlements, land use management, and the construction of buildings in the colonies.
Also critical to the spatial development of colonial African cities was this policy of racial segregation adopted by the British colonial state. In Kenya's capital city, Nairobi, for instance, this policy was formalized in the 1948 master plan, which divided the city into different racial residential areas for Africans, Asians, and Europeans. Likewise, from the 1920s onwards, in some areas of Nairobi, the colonial administration granted temporary occupancy licenses, which prevented Africans from owning land permanently. Licensees could only build temporary housing, which contributed to the development of informal settlements.
After independence, countries such as Kenya and Zimbabwe, and many others, also saw this racial spatial segregation transform into socio-economic segregation. This occurred as post-independence urbanization took place on the basis of these pre-existing patterns of segregation, which were often exacerbated as cities grew in size.
Today, the spatial inequality and segregation of African cities is embedded in the urban form, which hides the poor, who often live on small marginal lands. Many live hours away from their places of work, causing mass daily commutes that clog the city's infrastructure. In Nairobi, for instance, 55% of the population resides on less than 5% of the land where they do not have secure tenure. What is clear from these factors is that urban planning systems of many African cities, which were often permeated by colonial regulations, are inadequate for the reality and pace of urban transformation.
Turning this lens to London, we are interested in how our research can inform housing design standards. So according to the 2011 census, London is the most ethnically diverse region in England and Wales, with 40.2% of London's population identifying as Black, Asian, mixed or other. With this in mind, we question why we still only use British or European housing standard types to design housing for the future, thus excluding other modes of living that are relevant to our society. There is a necessity to understand the spatial and cultural needs of the city's demographic. Beyond these specified square meter standards, can we consider other qualities our housing needs in order to create socially and environmentally sustainable communities?
While other disciplines like music, visual arts, sociology, literature, and film have found ways of communicating cultural influence, architecture is yet to formally recognize this in how we think about the built environment. It is almost as if we still see people of the diaspora as temporary residents of the city without the same rights to the city as others. If London is home to such diverse communities, then we must question how our dominant housing typologies are addressing cultural nuance through design.
In Amos Rappaport's book, House, Form and Culture, he describes the house as follows. The house is an institution, not just a structure, created for a complex set of purposes. Because building a house is a cultural phenomenon, its form and organization are greatly influenced by the cultural milieu to which it belongs. Very early in recorded time, the house became more than just shelter, and almost from the beginning, function was much more than a physical or utilitarian concept. Religious ceremonies have almost always preceded and accompanied its foundation, erection, and occupation.
He goes on to add the following. If provision of shelter is a passive function of the house, then its positive purpose is the creation of an environment best suited to the ways of life of a people. In other words, a social unit of space.
Our research, titled The Course of Empire Compound House Typology, investigates and seeks to catalogue a series of standards and values specific to the compound house. This work is also now the subject of a Graham Foundation-funded publication. The research critiques the dominance of imported typologies more suitable to European contexts, which have often been unable to respond to the specific cultural and climatic needs of the region.
It is important that the growth of African cities is understood spatially and architecturally in response to history and culture. We must understand their inherent conditions and allow these to become tools for building a new paradigm for urban development. Another aspect of this, which we seek to challenge, is how architectural building and cultural practices are recorded. Our work cannot be limited to the current tools of academic research, which typically have excluded certain forms of knowledge and archival practices, relegating the shared narratives and storytelling traditions that are so important to the survival of African history and culture. Essentially, traditional tools used for research and dissemination of knowledge in Europe don't necessarily apply when working on the African continent. In order to deconstruct racial prejudice within our practice and discourse, I offer this quote by Mabel Wilson from the introduction to Race and Modern Architecture. And I quote, "First, historians must expand the range of figures and objects we study to include the work of non-white subjects, including people who have previously been deemed outside of history, whose records were seen as not worthy of preservation."
So in doing our research, we're also critiquing the story of modernity, the modern concept of universal standards, and the foundation of modern science and empirical knowledge, as well as Eurocentric anthropology. So literature has been a source of inspiration for us for thinking about how we work towards these aspirations. Writers like Toni Morrison, Audre Lorde, and Bell Hooks explore centrality and language in their work. Morrison speaks about the centrality of Blackness, while Lorde implores us to think about our tools for critical practice. In Teaching to Transgress, Hooks reflects on Adrienne Rich's poem, The Burning of Paper Instead of Children, where she explores this particular line. "This is the oppressor's language, yet I needed to talk to you." Hooks writes, "They make me think of standard English, of learning to speak against Black vernacular, against the ruptured and broken speech of the dispossessed and displaced people. Standard English is not the speech of exiles. It is the language of conquest and domination." And yet, she goes on to say, "It can also be the potential site of resistance."
In working towards finding new models of translation, we're interested in precisely these ideas on how and what we record and ascribe meaning and value to. We seek to do this work as architects through our reflections on space and place and imagining new paradigms for how we live. Housing affects a society's mode of living. The rituals of our daily lives are shaped and transformed by our built environment. The house, we believe, is central to these ideas about ritual and dwelling. It is both individual and communal. It is a private entity that can be understood as a cultural institution. In exploring the compound house typology, we are using architecture to initiate a conversation around culture, ritual, Indigenous systems of knowledge and production, as well as asking questions about the relationship between traditional and contemporary building culture. These are a series of examples. These are a series of examples of traditional case studies of compound houses, which in what is now known as Ghana. You can see examples of Lobi, Fanti, and Akan houses, as well as a recent urban house found in Accra.
Growing up, I experienced two compound houses in Kenya. The first was a two-story family home in NYALI, Mombasa, where I lived as a child in the 90s with two other families, part of my extended family. The house had a fluid connection to the outdoors, and I constantly moved in and out of it, whether playing in the courtyard, helping my grandmother pick jasmine flowers, watching my aunts make ugali, mocha breads, roast meat, fry chapati, steam the biryani, pound spices, or wash dishes. I always felt connected to the other people in the house through this courtyard space. When I was inside, I could see my mother, father, uncle, guests entering the compound through the gate leading to it. On Fridays, al-Jum'ah, or congregation in Arabic, other members of our extended family would gather for lunch and afternoon prayers. The other compound house I experienced was my grandmother's house in Isli, a neighborhood located in the denser and poorer part of Nairobi, which was named in 1921 after a town in the English county of Hampshire. There was a mix of permanent and temporary shops around its front perimeter. And even though these shops felt separate from the house within the gate, they were part of the plot, and the shop owners rented the units from my grandmother. Surrounding the courtyard were residential units with covered and portioned verandas. My uncles lived in two of these units, and the rest of the units were rented out to small families or individuals. The central courtyard space was used all year round, predominantly for hanging laundry and washing dishes. In addition, it was where the communal toilets and bathrooms were located. A few of the units had their own private toilets, but the rest of the tenants used these communal ones. The residents either collectively paid to have these spaces cleaned or themselves would take turns in cleaning them.
My experience of compound housing begins with reflections from my parents about the houses and communities they grew up in. These places outside of Accra often held a more communal spirit and embedded this in their spatial configuration and architecture of a place. My father describes his hometown of Kwaso in Kumasi, Ghana's second largest city, in his childhood in the 1960s, and he remembers a town of compounds where, as a boy, he moved freely between his grandmother's compound and his father's house. In these descriptions, there's a sense of a spatial plan that is dictated by the singular entity of the house and transformed through the typology of the compound. There are also more intimate descriptions of how his grandmother used the compound for a variety of activities, from customary rites and ceremonies to the preparation of food. My own upbringing in Accra in a more urban situation differs from my parents' experiences, yet I can also remember the spaces of our home which mimic many of these qualities. The kitchen yard and front yard, the kitchen yard replaced the compound in our home and served in contrast to the more formal front yard as a space for fostering communal and familial relationships. Looking back and remembering these spaces with the gaze and training of an architect, I question how we can rethink the configuration of the African house, abandoning decontextualized norms which linger as a legacy of colonization, and use the compound house typology as a spatial generator that can produce spaces better suited to our lifestyles and customs.
We will now explore the principles of the compound house. From our research to date, we have identified 5 key attributes which form our understanding of this typology. Privacy is first. The compound house presents a very particular dichotomy between public and private, regulated by a privacy mechanism. In all compound houses, the private domain is linked in some way to the public realm of the settlement. There is a clear progression from the private bedroom at one end of the hierarchy through the semi-private veranda through to the semi-public courtyard, and then to the public side alley, off which the main entrance door generally opens. The deliberate orientation of the entrance away from the main public street further enhances privacy within the courtyard proper. The form of the relationship between the private and public domain via a lock is more fundamental than the actual shape of the domain.
The unroofed open courtyard provides a setting, or rather a subsystem of settings, within which specific activities can occur as part of a larger organization of activities. Acting as the hearth of the compound house, this space is where inter-household relations and collective social values are developed and nurtured, and where intergenerational knowledge is transferred and shared. It provides an important setting which fits into a larger system encompassing the surrounding street, block, and neighborhood. Furthermore, it is a central space, providing access to other spaces. It feels civic in presence, a microcosm of a public square set within a private domain.
So between the relatively private bedroom at the furthest end and the semi-public courtyard Nana just described is the semi-private covered veranda on which households do most of their routine cooking. In the rural and early urban versions, the veranda served as a thoroughfare. However, in the contemporary urban compound house, which is typically shared by the resident owner and tenant households, this space can become congested as most cooking takes place here. The demand for more privacy and for the accommodation of personal belongings, which cannot conveniently be kept in the bedroom, has prompted the partitioning of verandas into further semi-private spaces, especially in multi-story urban settlements. The cleaning of communal spaces was typically performed by female residents on a rota basis. However, as with many aspects of domestic labor, it has either deteriorated or become contracted to the private sector.
Unlike the more structurally complex villa type, The singular story compound house is faced horizontally rather than vertically, and is usually occupied as soon as the first few rooms are complete. Its construction is incremental and progressive, with rooms added as funding comes in. The structural simplicity of the compound house means that it is more easily extended than an individual self-contained unit. The amenability to extension is particularly important in certain economies where land and servicing costs are high in relation to local wages. In addition, due to the shared cost of services and utility spaces, compound construction entails relatively low cost per unit of accommodation.
So lastly, the compound houses attribute of being able to form settlement fabric and show collective identity. So historically, family compounds were linked by pedestrian routes, which connected them to important communal centres such as markets, religious buildings. The compound walls would generally be decorated to signpost entrance thresholds or main front facades. Other walls of the compound would remain plain, lacking in specific identity and forming part of the urban fabric. Symbols and decorations then would appear only in certain spaces within the compound, such as thresholds or in the courtyard. Such decorations come to embody a collective identity in relation to the overall identity of the city, town, or village fabric by locally representing or distinguishing ethnic groups or neighborhood units.
Indigenous land division was based on communal land that was subdivided by community for private or exclusive use. Land was sold and usually allocated by means of common agreement and decree. Public or communal land was subdivided, or private land was demarcated out of communal land to create allotments. Land was then managed either by the family or the individual. Access to resources such as water and pathways modified land boundaries. The line between private and public space is a negotiated boundary, delineated by agreement and enforced by community. Although these demarcations are respected, they are seldom mapped or described in writing, and therefore easily modified, and are often only communicated verbally to the next generation.
So this is Kumasi, Ghana's second biggest city, as described. And Ejisu is a district in Kumasi. It is also famously the hometown of Ya Asantewa, the Queen Mother who led the war against the British to defend the Golden Stool in 1900. The Ejisu Bese Shrine House derives its name from its location. Bese Ase is a noun with a preposition meaning under the kola nut. Bese means kola nut, the fruit of the kola nut tree that is native to the tropical rainforest in this region of West Africa. It is often used ceremonially, presented to chiefs or guests. And finally, Ase means under, extending or directly below, behind or hidden.
The Ejisu Bese Ase Shrine House are the foundations of typical Asante housing, whether designed for human inhabitation or for deities. These houses typically consist of 4 separate rectangular single-room buildings set around an open courtyard. The inner corners of the adjacent buildings are linked by means of splayed screen walls whose sides and angles could be adapted to allow for any inaccuracy in the initial layout. Typically, the three of the buildings are completely open to the courtyard, while the fourth is partially enclosed, either by a door or windows, or by open work screens flanking an opening. And a striking feature of such buildings is the elaborate mural decorations. The upper walls are covered with an interlacing geometrical shape designs, which, while the lower parts are boldly modelled with bas-relief adinkra symbols, with large variety in the design in the red clay polished to a dull shine.
So we visited the Ejisu Bese Ase Shrine House in November 2019 with architecture students and colleagues from Kingston School of Art. We were greeted by 32-degree heat as we poured out of our minivan. The external facades of the compound were plain white and resembled the neighboring buildings at first glance, and the structure did not stand out as one of the most prominent historic buildings in the area.
Viewed from the road, only the steeply pitched grey thatched roof jumped out as a defining feature, making the building significantly taller than the surrounding single-storey dwellings. As we got closer to the building, we noticed the crafted details of its bamboo structure underneath the thatch, as well as the children sitting on the projected knee-high plinth, which was the same colour as the earth beneath our feet. I entered through the timber panelled door and the covered veranda and the stepped edge into the compound.
The stepped edge also served as theatrical seating for our group as we gathered in the shade to listen to our guide, Mr. Osai Safo Kantanka, or Teacher Kantanka, a historian of the Ashanti Empire. Standing in the shade of the tree within the courtyard, he explained the history of the building. The proxemics of the rectilinear space created a good and considered acoustic atmosphere. The scale and intricacy of the laterite red plinth, which contrasted with the white walls, alluded to a civic quality within the courtyard. The single tree and surrounding vegetation added an informal and intimate atmosphere to the space.
We'll now talk a bit about the modes of translation which we employ in our work. We consider our teaching practice a mode of translation. In 2019 to 2020, we led a second-year studio at Kingston School of Art, which developed proposals that began to implement ideals of the compound house into contemporary housing projects in Accra and London. The 6 projects shown here explore the communal and the compound, each in their own way, thinking through design through precedent, observation, and translation as a direct reference to what can be achieved by widening the canon and our sources and precedents in teaching. This year, in our third year of studying contemporary and traditional African domestic architecture, we're working in Nigeria. Investigation notions of community, congregation, and identity. We are interested in the role of domestic space and civic architecture in manifesting shared identities and histories.
At the AA, Diploma 2 is focused on the condition of diaspora and its contingent dualities, characters, and cultures. We are interested in examining, challenging, and shifting these architectural critiques towards more inclusive and holistic understanding of inhabitation as a consequence, the built environment more broadly. The unit is investigating the concept of the other versus the self as a critical basis for our agenda, relating this to the inhabitation of space and place in the UK's diasporic communities, with a primary focus on the domestic condition.
The Archaeological Pavilion is a manifestation of many of the ideas we've described this evening. It is a project generated by our research. Situated in the Giardini della Manaressa, the pavilion forms a gathering space to celebrate Black and diaspora voices in response to the Biennale's questioning theme, how we will live together. The 5x5 Pavilion has hosted a series of exhibitions and talks focused on the architecture of Africa and the Black diaspora. A colourful tapestry of Ghanaian wax fabrics forms the roof of the pavilion, taking inspiration from Jamestown Cafe in the capital city of Accra. The language of pattern is echoed in the jute panels on the pavilion's exterior. The structure's vibrant, bright and pink hues, meanwhile, reference the architecture of Accra, especially Jamestown, the historic centre of the city.
So we believe architecture is always a collective work. It is about working together with us, for us, as a human race. The project team of the project team is how it all begins and is the first moment of working collaboratively. We are practice-led of 2 people, for example, which means that by its very essence, all our work is collaborative. We also work with other disciplines, from structural engineers, manufacturers, makers, builders. This particular project was exciting because there was an additional layer of working with another practice, one-to-one collectives, as well as students from Kingston University in the construction stages of the project. Working collaboratively also applies to how projects may be funded. On larger public projects, a project may receive funding from various bodies. These stakeholders can be thought of as collaborators too, as it is with their support of that project that it is able to be realized. The Archaeological Pavilion is a project that was funded through donations and sponsorships. For us, this makes it ultimately a public project, and its backers and stakeholders are in the project.
The simple but effective structural logic of the pavilion can be read in this image. A system of columns at 600 millimeter centers are supported with diagonal bracing and connected to the base, providing rigidity and structural stability. In addition to this, the structure was weighted down with sandbags infilled between the structural columns of the base.
Sitting between the columns are decorative panels made simply from jute, an affordable and common material stretched over a rigid timber frame like a canvas. These jute frames are hand-painted with patterns inspired by the Ashanti Adrinka symbols. The technique of hand-painting these panels is inspired by the housing of the Gurunzi people in northern Ghana and southern Burkina Faso.
To conclude, we give you our opinions on what it means, what success means, and what we're trying to achieve with these new models of translation.
There's better working practices towards a less patriarchal and labor-intensive model of practice.
We also want to shape our practice by thinking more broadly and laterally about our building culture and building industry. We should be working towards models that can encompass less standardized methodologies and ways of living and seeing the world, including effect and policy to ensure housing standards reflect this wide range.
Architecture, unlike other disciplines, is still in its infancy in thinking about how we translate these ideas into built form. Our work, which includes research, teaching, and building, is about searching for these answers. The process is important to us. It is the site of translation, of working towards new models and shifting our conversations about culture, architecture, and practice towards a more inclusive framework.
Thank you for listening, and we're happy to take any questions you might have.
Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Bushra and Nana. Thank you. That was... I kind of forgot that I was supposed to be involved in this event, and I was just making notes like some sort of fangirl. I'm hoping that there are questions and reflections and things that would come from the audience. Once again, anyone is welcome to either send me in DMs or place in the chat, or you can simply raise your hand and I'll ask if that's all right to unmute you. So, first of all, again, thank you for that lecture. And without wanting to sound too, let's say, old before my time, I'm really proud to see both of you defining and creating these opportunities to practice in the way that you think you should. It's really great to see you claiming that space and kind of claiming that voice and agency to define those things, rather than, let's say, dealing with the status quo and letting yourselves get in any way cynical or jaded or embittered. You're kind of defining the way forward. So I'm really in a lot of admiration. I'm sure some of our audiences too. So I kind of thought about asking you questions that move through, I suppose, different phases of what you said in the talk. Initially, you talked about your interests coming from a set of frustrations, and I relate hard to that. I think sometimes good ideas do come out of adversity and frustrations, but specifically in relation to decolonization, how it's addressed in terms of architectural knowledge and what you were exposed to. Can I ask you to maybe expand a little bit on that? And maybe because you're teaching now at the AA, maybe we can talk a little bit about how you seek to address that with your students. Two questions in one a little bit.
Yeah, sure. Nana, you want to go first?
Yeah, sure. So I guess in terms of what we think about kind of this agenda to decolonize, I think it's really important to understand what the terminology that we use is and what decolonizing means. And in recent times, we've really seen a word that really comes from movements around returning land to the indigenous owners, co-opted by kind of creative industries to talk about what essentially really is broadening the canon and allowing previously excluded voices to be part of the conversation. that probably isn't decolonizing. It is simply about realizing that other people have things to say, which are powerful and can also contribute to all our learning. And I guess how we sort of think about it is influenced by that very definition. We're not interested in kind of decolonization frameworks that are centered around kind of EDI mechanisms for dealing with these things. We understand the place for them, but it's certainly not our interest as architects, designers, or educators. For us, when we think about how we decolonize an architectural education, it's really about widening the curriculum. And we've been very lucky to work in institutions and now at the AA with people that are interested in having these conversations. And our studio at the moment, called the Coals of Empire, so Diploma 2, it's really about investigating those things. It's about asking these questions. We also realize that the questions we're asking within other disciplines have answers to them. So you can look towards sociology, visual arts, sort of drama performance arts. Those already have started the journey in questioning how identity and culture plays a part in the world of the arts. But architecture is still quite behind on that. And even though it's probably the art form that shapes our very existence most, it's the one that is weakest in really understanding how cultural identity, and actually just identity more generally, can produce a more pluralistic and holistic understanding of space. And so that's what we're really interested in our teaching. And that's what we feel, these ideas about decolonization should be moving towards. It's less about the kind of seen as an aside from critical practice, bringing it into the conversation about how we teach and what we teach. And centering, like we've talked about, it's like kind of centering these peripheral conversations rather than keeping them at the periphery and just like, oh, you can dip in later. And I think, or as an extra module or whatever, I think as a kind of most fundamental, it's also about kind of valuing, so offering a range and also valuing the kind of plethora of experiences, lived experience in general. So I think that's how we see the term decolonization. So of course, talking about the effects of colonization is part of that, which is what we're trying to do in our unit, but really kind of valuing a wide range of experiences and cultures rather than saying one is the right answer, as it were. Yeah. I suppose it's also, just to add to that, I also think that it's about understanding for whose benefit this is. And I think that for a long time, it's been seen as the benefit when we talk about decolonization, and the reason why for so long it's been seen as an additional thing is because it's centering the things that people of color and Black people know. And it's saying that these things are also important. And there's always been a sort of reticence towards accepting that these are valuable lessons for everyone. So when we talk about how we approach our work, it is not with the lens of it's to only center non-white or minority or Black people. It's also recognizing that this work is of value to everyone. The more we all know, the better our knowledge and the better our kind of societal models can be.
That's a really fulsome answer from both of you. I think I just do this to process myself, but it seemed like you moved from the frustrations that you felt in, let's say, absence of what's in the curriculum to a slightly more nuanced position about where they are in the curriculum, not just over here in the sort of exotic box, but perhaps more at the center of discussion, more as the source of discussion. Mm-hmm. And also in terms of accessibility, perhaps even coming back to that first frustration of allowing people to see themselves as agents, or their cultures perhaps as having agency. Mm-hmm. Really interesting. I think that definitely comes from, and also I noted in your presentation you were very generous with your lived experience, really centering that as a kind of motivating force for your research.
I think it's important. Yeah, anyway, I think it's important for us to kind of not pretend that that's a sort of driving force for the research and the practice. Of course, I think though when you kind of break it open, it's like a lot of people share similar experiences, if not of the compound house, perhaps of like a courtyard house somewhere else, and this way of or a certain way of living where you live very communally, you live with extended family, etc. So really trying to understand that even though it's an individual experience, it might be shared by a wider range of people.
Mm-hmm.
That makes sense. So it might be just us too, but actually lots more people have similar experiences.
Absolutely. I mean, I didn't grow up in continental Africa, and there are lots of things that you talk about in terms of lived experience and how that translates into an architectural strategy of analysis that I find really resonant. And I think it's fair to say, don't you think, that things are slightly changing in the sense that, well, you're proof of that it is possible to center these other experiences, other lived experiences that can now be centered. All right. Well, there are some questions coming in from people asking, so I'm going to park my own for a second.
Yeah.
I have more, but all right. So I have one question from another Nana in the audience, who asks, why is it that you chose to focus your studies on compound houses in particular? Maybe this, I don't know if this links to the experience thing, or if it's something else that intrigues you about that typology.
Bushra, you can start, or?
Yeah, I am happy to start. So I think, so definitely a lived experience of these spaces, but I think beyond of compound houses, as we both taught and growing up in Kenya and Ghana. But I think beyond that, we really identified the house or the domestic space as the kind of site for diasporic cultures to sort of have agency and to express agency. And so we thought as the first point to affect change, that sounds very, like I'm going to save the world, but the first point is to affect change. We thought the domestic space was the best site to explore. Of course, like we would be interested in other typologies, but to begin with, we just saw the kind of domestic space or the home as if you think about diasporic cultures, especially when they move from their home or the place of origin, it's the place where you can truly sort of manifest your identity without other factors or other agents.
Oftentimes the only place where you can do that, right?
Yeah,
often the only place.
Exactly. Oftentimes the only place. So that's why we thought that would be the particular point of starting for us. Yeah.
I think it also goes back to a question, again, this question of the kind of frustrations that we both shared and perhaps linked us, was this question of being asked, what's African architecture like? Like you can categorize the diversity of 54 countries, over 2,000 languages and tribes into a singular kind of this is what African architecture is. But the thing that does link almost all of those ways of living across different countries is the mode of living. So there's a very kind of communal element of how we live. And that was historically true. It is changing with the kind of with globalization and other forces, but it does still maintain, it does still keep to that kind of communal living. And so perhaps it was less when we think about what African architecture is, most people are trying to nail that to a look or some sort of formal attribute. But yet perhaps it's less to do with the formality of its architecture and more to do with what the architecture does and who it serves and how it serves a purpose. And the compound house felt like a really succinct thing to look at in terms of really understanding how people live. And even though they're over 54 countries, there are different typologies, you always find it comes back to that kind of very communal element of living. And so in some ways, it was trying to kind of answer questions we felt maybe were a little bit daft. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's totally fair. I mean, when one is talking about a context outside of itself, there are questions that come from a position of unknowing or a position of almost preconception. And I think what's interesting about your answer is that without diluting that specificity of culture or context, you're trying to talk about it in terms of space, in terms of architectural quality. You were talking about gradients of privacy, communality, and, as you say, the way people are living out their lives in space, which of course means that those architectural strategies become accessible. If they're decoupled from a particular kind of national identity, let's say, or cultural or ethnic identity, then we can start to think about these as truly architectural and spatial strategies and formulae for living, which have been, really richly developed. So again, I think I understand what you're saying about the compound house as being a kind of microcosm, but particularly your approach and the way you describe it speaks to you're not necessarily celebrating those particular discrepancies, but looking at the architectural qualities. I guess I'm going to use that as a hinge to move from your teaching and, let's say, your academic practice to your built practice. I think I'm a historian. I've always enjoyed the space that academia affords us, where we can talk about diaspora, we can talk about the value of different cultures. And it's a very different place to, let's say, the market or the industry or the world where things need to get built. Can you talk about how you maintain your position and your mode of practice now that you're building things?
Yeah.
Not just anywhere, but in Venice.
We've been very lucky because we kind of stated our position through our research and through academia. We've been very lucky that the things that have come our way, as it were, have afforded us to explore that trajectory and explore that interest. So Venice, of course, how will we live together was the theme, and
quite a gift.
Space, quite the gift, exactly. And beyond that, the person who we kind of worked with and included us in the bid was this man called Joe Addo, who runs Archaeological, which is a space in the historic centre in Jamestown, which is a kind of gallery and venue and hostel. And we kind of shared, things aligned, as well, the stars aligned, and we shared this interest in talking about the African diaspora and what it means when we start to inhabit space outside of Africa, or what that space looks like, it feels like, how it encourages the culture that we would we are accustomed to, or we're also trying to understand how it is that or what we can learn, not being very eloquent, what we can learn from the African continent in terms of how will we live together, especially in the future. So especially when we talk about things like climate change and the issues faced by very isolated lifestyles, these things we felt like we could really bring to the Biennale in terms of the conversation around how the diaspora inhabits space.
But I guess if the Biennale provides a sort of let's say a sort of curious bracket where this sort of discussion is possible, But you set up a practice, right? So I guess I want to know how you feel about negotiating the world of contracts and so on.
I guess, yeah, to that, I think we've been very lucky with a very nice trajectory of how our kind of ideas have manifested into projects and then into a practice. And I guess really for us, the opportunity to run our own practice and think about working for ourselves and making the work that we want to see is really one about really testing these ideas and critiques that we have about architecture and how it's done. We work at architecture at its, I don't know whether to say best or worst, but some part of it is a service industry. It's about providing your clients with what they've asked for. And any good architect has to do that. But it's also about thinking maybe more laterally about what practice is and trying to think about how we can imagine a new way of practicing. So for instance, I find it really interesting to observe the kind of idea that this is the way that things have always been done, and this is the way that it's always going to be. But we're still educating students, I hope, to go out into the world with a sense of vision for the future. And then we then have to think to ourselves, okay, so we're educating people to go out and think differently about how we can practice in a more sustainable way, in a more kind of efficient way that respects labor and people's time and, respects their boundaries and all of those things. But what does architectural practice are they going out there? What does that meet them with? And I guess in terms of our own practice, we're trying, and we're really at the beginnings, and it's, we've got a few projects, and we're really excited actually to be able to test out these ideas that we have about how we might transform practice through different ways and processes. And I guess without the kind of a whole portfolio of built outputs, what we're really enjoying at the moment is the process by which we get there. And the process feels really important. And for the most part, it's a thing that is not showcased or talked about. So we're very comfortable with talking about how our practice has progressed and been actually formulated as a process. It's come from our own frustrations, which is then translated into practice. It's then translated into really great opportunities to work with different people like Joado, One-to-One Collective, our students from Kingston who help us build the pavilion into a practice. That is a process that is perhaps quite different from how other people may have started the practice. But I think that it's interesting to think about we talk about decolonizing education, making sure that they're more Black and non-white architects, but we don't talk about the frameworks in which they might actually be able to engage in practice. For the most part, we don't really ever unpack the fact that architecture started as a profession that was, to be honest, a white man's leisurely activity. Travel, you go on the grand tour, you come back, you kind of sort of start to think about your grand ideas. That is not a practice or a model that needs you to earn money and survive. So if we are thinking about how we decolonize education, therefore bringing more non-white people from more different backgrounds and different levels of privilege, how do we make sure that this profession is fit to serve a purpose? That doesn't mean that we're bringing people into a burning house. We have to redefine a practice. And we hope that we're starting to do that a bit through our own and also by sharing the process of which we got there.
That being said, though, I will add, and we are very open with our clients as we approach them and as we pitch and bid for work, because that is what our interest is, identities and culture and etc. And for the most part, they kind of are very open to that and very engaged in that and prefer that we have a position. But I do want to add that, even through decolonizing education, decolonizing the practice as well, there are certain tools that we still use that are kind of architectural convention that we use that are part of our profession that we have accepted as like the language of architecture. But as we speak English now, almost universally, architectural convention tools we use universally as well to describe. That's why we show plans of these compound houses. For most of them, they wouldn't exist, and they would just be captured in photographs, for example, and in axos, etc. Yeah. So we're still using the same tools. What we want to add is that that is a tool that is used now, but how do we engage new tools and put them in with those conventional tools? So it's not just a singular way of conveying architectural. There are multiple ways.
Right. There is a beautiful quote that you raised. I think it was, I made a note of it. This is the master's language, and yet I use it to speak to you. And then there was, I noted ellipses, and then it can be the potential site of resistance. And I think that's what I'm taking, again, as an historian, I'm quite used to rhetoric and theory. And what I'm enjoying about your presentation is that it's really in the analysis, research, and building. And yes, the whole process that it takes to get there, that you're trying to enact these, let's say, decolonization methods that don't rest only in rhetoric or in, let's say, academia. Okay, so there are questions that are streaming in. I'm going to just throw some at you. You can take some time over, whichever ones take your fancy. What do you think about a sort of database of, I don't know how much you, I know you've looked at the compound house typology, but I'm not sure how you feel about the term vernacular architecture. The long debate, it goes back about 50 years, this debate about vernacular architecture. But the question was not necessarily about the word, but about the notion of a sort of database of vernacular architectural knowledge. What do you think of that idea? Perhaps attached to that, the question also suggests a sort of periodic table of decolonized architectural pedagogies. I guess, let me frame this for you. We kind of live in an era where we kind of expect information to be available and quite easy to come by. Sharing this sort of learning and kind of gaining trust and working with communities in the way that you do, it's hard won, it's not easy, and it's at the cost of perhaps easier and more lucrative work. What do you think then, in that context, about a sort of open access database of vernacular knowledge?
I've always approached this in this way, that for me, the research we do, we are two people that are interested in a subject. It does not make us experts on that subject. It is a subject that lots of people know things about. They, even beyond the African continent, that this form exists in other means of housing, courtyard houses, other ways of making dwelling in space. And I think that there is something to be said about a kind of humility that has to come with research, and understanding that you are building on the knowledge of others, and that you are, they're people that have, shared experiences and lived experiences of this typology, and you are building on their experiences too. So there's a kind of certain level of humility that has to come with it. That makes me, I guess, want to take time before kind of rushing towards a kind of centralizing a kind of database, because that then suggests that you have found everything and have closed the chapter on that. I think it's much more of a kind of work in progress, that we know it's one, and it's one that hopefully will invite other people to also share in and contribute to. And I guess in terms of a kind of centralized database, I would ask the question, we don't have one for Europe, so why do we need one for the rest of the world's architecture?
Okay, I think that's... Go ahead, Bushra, sorry.
I think we should try and be as specific as possible. I think that vernacular is too broad a term for the entire world. And database as well, the kind of terminology of the word database kind of throws up this idea of a digital archive, which is accessible on one hand to a certain group of people, but also completely inaccessible to another a group of people, you know, the elderly or people who don't have computers or whatever. So I think that probably they wouldn't be one, but there would have to be different types of databases that could respond to the multiplicity of people accessing it or interested in accessing it. And then also there's, I guess, the kind of gatekeepers of these databases, like Nana's talking about, like we are not the gatekeepers of this knowledge. And why we find kind of why our output is a book is, you know, it is kind of defined in a specific time and place, and it's physical, and it can be added to the series of knowledge rather than a database that feels definitive. Yeah.
I understand. Okay, well, I should say that the person asking didn't use the word database, they used online portal, but I think a lot of what you're saying still stands. I think it's really interesting, the ideas that you shared about notions of authorship and building upon knowledge, and that knowledge being accretive rather than definitive. So I think that's it goes towards answering a really provocative.
That being said, if information isn't there for a certain vernacular, of course, like more options of making that information available is great. It's just not to see that as the only solution.
Yes, and I think also there are sort of claims to ownership that you know, that's a whole different chapter. There are so many questions that are coming in, and we have about 15 minutes. So let me I'm going to read Vanessa's one, and then we're going to unmute some people who are ready to ask things themselves. Vanessa's question is in the chat. It says, what factor do you think is most important in forming the open and engaged community life that you're striving to create? Big question, which is why I wanted to ask it. What factor do you think is most important?
Forming the open and engaged community life.
I think it's about a kind of, I'm going to use the word humility again. It's about humility to recognize other people's ways of doing things as also right. There's a kind of generosity that comes with that humility, that is recognizing that other people have knowledge that you might not as well, and what you can learn from them. I think in the world of kind of more increasingly more shared tragedies, we have to become humble enough to learn from other people's ways of doing things. We can only look at things like COVID, where Europe and the northern part of the world has taken a real hit. And look at other communities that have much more kind of communal ways of doing things that were much more resilient because of those systems already in place. Or we can also think towards climate change and thinking about the fact that for centuries, people had ways of looking after the land, looking after ecological systems that meant that they did not lead to the disruption. And perhaps we can do more to learn from those Indigenous ways and practices of living that might, quite frankly, save us.
Yeah, just to add, shifting from individualism to kind of more shared and communal.
I think what's lovely about your answer of humility essentially is that it can be scaled. You know, we can be talking about humility at an individual scale of understanding each other. But I like the idea of institutional humility, or even governmental humility, if we can imagine such a thing. Okay, Paris has had their hand up for a very long time. Paris, would you like to unmute and ask your question? Can't hear you yet.
Sorry, it wouldn't let me unmute myself. You had to unmute me. Just hi. I just wanted to just say nice to meet you, Bushra. Nana, nice to speak to you again. I've obviously been following you guys for a really long time, and I spoke with Nana at length about this kind of topic about a year ago now. So it's really lovely to see how far you've taken that research and how much further you've pushed it since we last spoke. I really love what you guys are doing with like the compound house, and I particularly resonate with it because I'm from a Caribbean background, and we have not necessarily compound houses, although there are some, but a lot of verandas around our houses and kind of those communal areas built into our spaces where people can just kind of commune and come together as a community. And I particularly find North African and Middle Eastern architecture, which have courtyard houses. Very, very interesting, personally, anyway. My question to you is really just, now that you are seeing kind of your work grow on that stage, and you are getting a good reception. I'm really glad that you said that you didn't really get much pushback on it once you've kind of explained your stance. People seem to really be interested in it. Is there something in particular you would like to physically achieve beyond the academic side of the written ideas that you're trying to put forward?
Hi, Paris. Thank you for the question, and being a fan from afar. I didn't hear about the conversation, but thank you so much for following us. And the question you gave, I think definitely we want to achieve. So what we want to achieve is to create a kind of set of policies that will sort of affect the housing standards, not just in London. We would like to see a kind of set a policy that maybe would allow to create this type of this housing type in London, but also on the African continent. So how we could, so the kind of bigger, wider goal is how to translate the kind of single story, 2-story compound house to multi-story, denser compound house, because urban cities in Africa, so are getting denser and denser over time. So that's the kind of main goal of the research. Haven't been able to test it out yet, but we are working on something, particularly in Nigeria, and then also on a set of policies. So yeah, that's the kind of two outputs we would like to achieve very long term, probably 10 years in the future. So yeah, watch this space.
As you can tell, we are ambitious in our kind of the things we want to achieve, but also I guess in some ways there is also what we'd really like our work to do is also recognise that the things that separate us are perhaps smaller than we think. So we in the UK and in Accra, where I'm from, both places have a housing shortage. London has a housing crisis, Accra has a housing crisis. Both are building, but they're not serving the needs of those that they need to house. So it's really about, hoping that our work can contribute meaningfully towards some of these problems. And it's really about, testing out ideas in built form. And at the moment, it feels, especially with our teaching practice, we are asking questions that sometimes we're in it to also learn something, and we don't have all the answers. And I hope that doesn't make our students too uncomfortable. But we are in it to learn too, and to test out these ideas, and then hopefully be able to translate them into built artifacts. And I said in our presentation earlier that a lot of other disciplines have already found the ways of translating these things. Architecture is quite behind on that, and we're hoping that our built work will help us towards that.
I love this audacity and ambition where you're not afraid to say, listen, architect is a beginner in realizing some of these things, and we're going to sort of transform how things go. There are a couple of questions coming in still. We're going to have to wrap up after maybe one or two more, but I do want to extract every bit of juice that we can from the time that we have with you. So Anna had a question specifically about the compound house typology. Anna, that is Anna Kloos. If Thomas can help me unmute her, then maybe she can ask herself.
Hi, thank you so much for the presentation and this conversation. I'd be interested to know whether, from your experience or your memory, the typology of the compound house has certain sonic qualities associated to them, as in like sounds, and if that's something you would want to translate in your practice.
Just very, very quickly, I suppose it's also one thing that we're really clear about, and the way that we do our research and the things that we're talking about, is to make sure that we're not fetishizing a typology. And we also recognize that, yes, while there are really important things to be learned from this typology, it's sometimes seen as a historical one, and that people want the things that people want. They want, to live in cities. They want to live in housing that feels modern to them. But that's come at a cost of disregarding certain historical and traditional ways of thinking about dwelling. And also this very singular way of thinking about progress is very much then in the housing that we make. And I suppose I say that to say that for us, we also recognize, especially in kind of urban African cities, there are stigmas attached with compound house living. It's loud. If you follow a certain part of Twitter, it's called Compound House Twitter. It talks about the kind of daily kind of challenges of living in compound housing, the lack of privacy, all of those things. So they are things that we think should be should influence how we think about communal living, but they're also things that we recognize that you might want to think differently about in the kind of modern age. And so things like the communal aspects of compound house living, that very kind of inside-outside relationship between space that responds well to Africa's climate, are really important. When you come to maybe thinking about how that typology might be used in the Western world, obviously those kind of inside-outside spaces need to be more kind of hermetically divided, but there is still that essence of feeling like you belong to something greater. And that we talked about, both of us, about our upbringing in Bushra in Kenya and mine in Ghana, and talked about these spaces that were very much used by us and our families. The other part of that was that we're both here because we emigrated to the UK, and that's very stark difference of how the house is used was something that I personally just found so shocking, that we moved here into suburbia and it's just you and your family. Like you can't sort of go outside and feel quite communal. And so there are elements of that kind of communal presence in compound housing that we definitely like to carry over, but there are elements of it that we recognize are not suited for sort of modern lifestyles as well.
Mm. Yeah, I think Nana did a good job of answering that. I think in terms of sound, it would change on a daily basis, but of course, like being outside in nature, you get sounds of animals, birds, monkeys in NYALI actually sometimes, and things like that. But I think it's like so contextual, and I think it would only be relevant if there was a context that required it. I think particularly we talk about like using, or the compound space is used a lot to make food. Food is, it's loud with pounding spices or pounding fufu or whatever. It's also like, smells, and it's easier to cook outside because there's more space. So I think for me, like what I really associate with that space is the kind of smells of cooking and the sounds of cooking. And again, very contextual, but I kind of very much attached to how I relate to food and the kind of how I think, food is a very communal act, I think, in many cultures as well. So somebody mentioned commons, and I think there's probably a similarity with the commons and the compound house, but like Shimi said, we're not going to get into that today.
I mean, that was about knowledge sharing and creative commons, which is fascinating. Exactly. But we'll just have to convene another discussion. So, okay. We have 6 minutes. I'm going to ask you a fairly loaded and fairly big question, but you've made such inspiring and ambitious statements that I feel emboldened to ask you. So we've been talking about new models, and I think you mentioned actually this phrase right at the end of your lecture, and I was taken by this notion of a model for success. The architectural profession, the figure of the architect, there is a sort of, I guess, an established model for success. Mm-hmm. But obviously you guys are defining your own mode of practice, and I would want to ask, I mean, you've spoken about some of your own practice ambitions in specific terms, but maybe I could ask you more in terms of values. What would be a model for success that you'd hope for yourselves, for your students? Big question.
Yeah. Interesting. Yeah, it's great because we actually haven't like thought about this, so it's kind of off the cuff. But I think personally, my model for success is if the studio was kind of really not attached to us as individuals, Studio NYALI, but rather the intention and how it affected, people in general. So it's that it's kind of living on as a collaborative mode of practice. I think that would be success. For our students as well, I think I would personally push for them not to seek success as individuals, but rather as part of a wider group or agenda. But again, I think each to their own, and the whole point is that they feel empowered to pursue a mode of practice that is that works for them, rather than following the status quo.
Yeah, I would absolutely echo that, and it's why we work together, because without discussing, we still share the same.
Good job.
Things. And I sort of think about it through this African proverb that says, if you want to go quickly, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. And for me, that really summarizes this idea of how we want to work. That we recognize that it's about a kind of journey with other people, working. It's the reason why we don't run our practice separately. We work together because we really believe that collaborative effort really strengthens the way that we think and work. And I guess for thinking about our model of success, it's really to kind of foster this collaborative way of working through everything that we do at the different scales at which we work at. So for us, it's, writing a teaching brief is as collaborative as working on site with a contractor, working through how we're going to build this thing. It's all those elements that are important to our practice. And I guess for our students, while we have our own framework for success, I would not impose that on them. I think that what we have been able to do is to be daring enough to say, look, there is a mode of practice. We appreciate that mode of practice. We understand that mode of practice. And we're not kind of here to kind of bulldoze over history and the way that things have been done. But perhaps we could also start to introduce other ways of thinking about these things, not because we want to kind of be contrarian or go against the grain, but form a more inclusive mode of practice. And I think that would be for our students. I'd hope that what we're able to do is give you the tools to be audacious enough to think about your own model of success.
What a lovely, generous note to end on. Thank you so much for sharing with us at least this beginning part of your journey. Again, it's really impressive to hear you be so articulate and mature about your stance, even at this early stage. And I'm sure everyone here wishes you every success in that. So thank you particularly tonight to Manijay for organising this talk, for allowing me to stand in her footsteps. Thank you to Thomas for ably assisting me in making sure it doesn't all go wrong. Thank you to the audience for spending their Thursday night when there's so many other offers and things to do on a Thursday evening. And most of all, thank you to Nana and Bushra, to Studio NYALI. Thank you so much for sharing a bit of your story with us. I think Thomas is going to unmute everybody, I hope, so that if you feel like saying thank you or clapping or cheering or whatever you want to do, we can have a moment of joy at the end of the session. Okay.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you, Instant Disasters. Thank you so much. And
thanks a lot to me for being here. See you soon. Bye.
Thank you.
Take
Bye.
Bye bye.